Hey scholars, welcome to Chapter 5.3 of AP Environmental Science. We're looking at what limits the growth of populations. And so we know that no population can ever grow indefinitely. At the beginning of our course, actually in Chapter 1, I got asked you to try to fold a piece of paper as many times as you can, and most of you got to 7. So we're looking at no species actually can grow, which that represented in that activity, exponential growth. So really no species can continue to exponentially grow forever. There are always going to be some limitations on resources because of competition for that resource among those species. So we're going to look at kind of what limits that growth of populations. Certain populations have certain characteristics, and populations kind of differ in 3 different ways. One of those is distribution, how they're actually dispersed in an environment. Then obviously the numbers, how many there are of something, and also the age structure. Taking a look at what are the kind of the age ranges of those organisms within that species or population, and we call all those 3 things together population dynamics. So we're going to take a closer look at those individually. But populations do have certain characteristics. There are changes in population because of temperature, the presence of diseases, right? Organisms that have harmful chemicals in them. Or are affecting that population, resource availability, which is the biggest one, and then also the arrival or disappearance of those competing species if there is some competition for that niche. So those are some different populations can get those characteristics due to these different factors: temperature, diseases, resources, or competition. So most population live together in clumps or patches, like a great example, Meerkat Manor, right? They're always living in clumps or colonies. Ants is a great example of them, even lions and prides. So clumping is a good example of things living together. And sometimes they are uniformly dispersed or randomly dispersed. And we'll talk about a couple of these different types here today. So first of all, why would organisms want to live together in groups or clumps or patches? And species tend to cluster because of where the resources are, where those resources are actually available to that population. And groups usually have a better chance of finding those resources if they are in groups because of the fact that they have more members to look for them. They also give some protection from some animals from predators, like elephants will literally surround the juvenile elephants and actually form a kind of a protection circle from the predators trying to get to that baby. Packs or groups allow to get prey like wolves or lions and prides using group hunting tactics to literally take down prey and then share based on a hierarchy the prey item that they've accomplished to kill. And temporary groups sometimes just happen because of mating and caring for young. For instance, like they think sharks tend to cluster in large groups, especially hammerheads, in order to mate. There are things that literally come together to one place, like I think penguins do it. A couple different examples there of where they just literally come together to mate, and then they kind of go on their separate ways after the young have been cared for. So the next thing is looking at populations can grow, shrink, or remain stable. And they're all that population size is always governed by about 4 things: births, how many births there are, how many deaths there are in the population, how many organisms are coming into the population through immigration, and how many organisms are getting kicked out or leaving the population because of emigration, which is leaving. So this is a good equation, though. Population change equals births plus immigration minus the deaths plus emigration. It's kind of the pros, minus the cons, and that it gives you your population change. Good one to know. That will come up on a quiz sometime. Maybe not this one, but maybe the next one. Age structure. That was the 3rd thing we looked at with population dynamics. In age structure, there are basically 3 groups, the groupings of age structure. There is the pre-reproductive age, which hopefully you scholars are at right now, unfortunately know differently, the reproductive age, and then the post-reproductive age. And those are our 3 main categories of age structure. This should be able to predict population changes for future based on that age structure. So based on what we know, if we took a survey of the population of a certain species, what we know about that population based on those 3 sections of age structure, we should be able to predict what is going to happen to that population. Is it going to grow, shrink, stay the same? What's going to happen with it based on the age structure that we survey? So we're going to look closer at this in a little bit. But no population can grow indefinitely, and we call if a population can, which we call the J-shaped curve or a J curve, that's exponential growth. We call the S-shaped curve kind of a logistic growth curve. And organisms this term biotic potential is your capacity for growth. If you have a high biotic potential, you're probably going to grow quite a bit. You're going to grow a lot because you have the resource available. There's not as much limiting factors. But if you have a low body potential, then you're, based on your reproduction, like for instance, pandas. I think we use that in an example later. Pandas have a very low body potential because of that. They only reproduce so often, and they only have very specific resources, and it has to be everything. All the conditions have to be right for them to reproduce. So kind of a low. That's an example of a low body potential. This definition here, intrinsic rate of increase, or R, is really the rate at which a population would grow if there was unlimited resources, and that would again look like a J-shaped curve, kind of going from small to very large very quickly. And individuals or populations with a high R, or if they can grow with unlimited, they would reproduce early in life. This would be an example like cockroaches, I think the book gives, and we'll look at those in a bit. They reproduce early in life. They have very short generation times, which means they go from juvenile to adult very quickly, and that allows them to reproduce even more. It can reproduce many times, not just once throughout the year, and have many offspring every time they reproduce. So insects are a really, really great example of our species, our selected species, because of the fact that they have, they can grow with unlimited resources, and they can probably grow really fast if they had unlimited resources, because they can grow fast, because of all these different characteristics we're going to talk about. All right. Also, size of populations are limited by these resources are usually the main ones: light, water, space, physical space, nutrients, and exposure to competitors, predators, or diseases. So that's really that's what most of those limiting factors are caused by those 5 things: light, water, space, nutrients, or exposure to competition, predators, or diseases. All right, a few other things: environmental resistance. They are a combination of all the factors that limit population growth. So all those we just talked about together equal environmental resistance. They're all just all the factors that limit the growth of a population. Carrying capacity is represented by a K, and that is like the max population of a species a habitat can sustain. And carrying capacity is kind of the variable way of showing that resistance on a population. And that's what we call that carrying capacity, where the population literally levels off, and we call that logistic growth. So exponential growth would be your R-selected species, as well as with unlimited resources, and logistic would be more of like a K-selected, which kind of reach carrying capacity kind of quick. So science focus. Why are protected sea otters making a slow comeback? Well, they have a very low body potential, which is not good for their population growth of their species. They are prey for orcas. They actually are more susceptible to cat parasites that are coming out in the wash of sewage into the ocean. There are lots of negative things that you're going to read about before you do an assignment for me. I think, we already did it. Headed worms, toxic algae blooms, PCBs, oil spills. There are lots of things that are very, very detrimental and could have a major impact on the population of sea otters. So they're making a slow comeback because of all these things. If those things, which most of them are human caused, other than the top 2, most of them probably would be, they would actually make a faster comeback, although the low body potential does kind of put them and set them back a ways. But this does show you the population size of southern sea otters off the coast of Southern California back to the early 80s until about now. This is the end of 2006, so that was quite a few years ago, I guess, still. But still showing them that they have a slow growth. They've dipped down a few times here and there. Had a number like 94 was a big year of growth. Even 2004 looks like was a big year of growth. Now it's kind of leveling off again. But they are making a slow comeback. Hopefully they continue to do so. This just shows you graphically what's going on here. So body potential, you have a very high. That's the J shape right there. And then eventually, once it reaches that carrying capacity, those environmental resistance, all 5 or 6 or whatever I labeled them or talked about earlier, then that population literally stabilizes and it kind of stays around the same size for a long period of time. Now it'll dip up and down here and there, but not by great numbers. This is just looking up sheep production off the island of Tasmania. So looking at literally breeding sheep for farming and whatnot. And back in the 1800s, we had lots of exponential growth, lots of grass and area for that. This was probably based on area and resources like grass and what they were feeding on. The population did overshoot there a little bit, and that does happen. And then you have some die-off that you go below, where that population runs out of resources, kind of crashes a little bit, but eventually kind of reaches and then stabilizes around that carrying capacity. And so that's kind of just a look at how the logistic growth curve works. When populations exceed its habitat and carrying capacity, its population can crash. And that does happen. It's called kind of that reproductive timeline may lead to overshoot or die back or crash. And that's what we were going to kind of focusing on with the sheep. This is kind of that dieback or crash days where literally, the population overshoots, not enough resources, so a lot of organisms might die for a little bit, but there will still be some that live on and then reproduce and then kind of balance around there. But that's called dieback or crash, and it's because of reproductive time lag, and that's basically saying that the organisms literally have died and because they've overshot and then the resources are gone, so they die, and then eventually it'll reach back up because it takes time for those organisms to reproduce and then go back up to carrying capacity. That's what we talk about with reproductive time lag. Damage may reduce an area's carrying capacity. So sometimes if this overshoot is too high and those organisms overeat, this carrying capacity can kind of drop down a little bit. Not a ton, but it will limit the resources that are available again next year and the year after. And so that's what they're talking about with damaging that area. This is just looking at exponential growth, overshooting population crashes of reindeer. Kind of showing you this image here, 1910, growing huge in 1940, and then population crashes because not enough resources, are available. So back in the 1950. So that's just kind of showing you an example of a overshoot and then a dieback. All right, talked about these two already, but our selected species are opportunists. They reproduce early in life. They're usually small. They have large numbers when they reproduce. No parenting, short lifespans. They are opportunists. They are selected. Again, a great example, cockroaches or insects. K-selected species are competitors. They're ones that reproduce later in life. Larger organisms, usually small. They reproduce in small numbers. They do parent. They usually have longer lifespans, so it takes them a little bit longer to reproduce in large numbers. So those are your K-selected species, kind of more impacted by limiting factors. And this just shows you a couple different types. Here's the R-selected species, lots of growth, and K-selected where they're actually hitting carrying capacity quite a bit. Lots of other different vocabulary here. This is kind of based off of genetics, but then we'll go through this pretty quickly for you. This is the founder effect, where individuals in the population colonize new area that is uninhabited. And that's just showing you that one organism's there, founder, yeah, found it. It's the founder effect, and they're colonizing a new area that's uninhabited, kind of like lichens. Lichens is a great example of a founder species that literally inhabits an area first, and then kind of allows for the organisms to survive later. Demographic bottleneck is where only a few individuals survive a catastrophe, and therefore there's only a few organisms that can survive and reproduce and then grow in numbers. That population, again, we call that bottlenecking, kind of bringing the population down to a very, very small amount. Genetic drift is where we have random changes in genes that can lead to unequal reproductive successes based on members of the species. So that might lead to some organisms dying off, like the demographic bottlenecking. So a big catastrophe happens, a lot of organisms die off, and but some of those, the ones that have the genes that are successful to do that, can lead to unequal reproductive success. Basically saying that, hey, if I'm better suited because of my genes, then I can reproduce more than you because I have better genes than you, basically, because of the situation. Inbreeding, individuals in a small population mate with one another, and this happens a lot when you have geographic isolations. If you have members of the same group that have kind of mingled together and left together, but then they inhabit an area and there's no other species there, they're gonna inbreed, and that happens, and that does happen with in nature a lot. Minimal viable population size. This is an estimate of the number of individuals needed for long-term survival. So, for instance, most of the time it would be 2 if there's plenty of resources available. The minimum, if you have boy and a girl, male and female of each, you should be able literally to reproduce. But if the genetics aren't right, you reproduce in brother and sister and so forth, it might not work out. So sometimes you need a few more than just 2, but that's just the minimum viable population size. All right. There are some density-dependent controls. It means how many organisms in a given area, and this is matter. So predation is one of them. If there's a lot more organisms in a given area, better chance they're going to get might be preyed upon. Parasitism, another one. Infectious diseases. If you're close to, there's a lot of people in very close, tight spaces, good chance that disease is going to spread. And even if there's a lot of organisms in one area, there's probably a competition of resources in that area too. So those are what we call density-dependent population controls. Those 4: predation, parasitism, infectious disease, and competition for resources. All right, several types of population changes occur in nature. One of those is stable, another one is eruptive, one of those is cyclical fluctuation, like boom and bust cycles, and we'll talk about top-down and bottom-up population regulations, as well as irregular, kind of just no reoccurring pattern, just kind of goes up and goes down based on a number of different factors. So let's take a look at one, for example. This is the population cycle for the snowshoe hare and the Canadian lynx. Obviously, this is a predator-prey relationship. The hare is preyed upon by the lynx. But you can see some correlation if you look at this. And this is what we call a top-down population regulation, where usually the predator is keeping other organisms in check. Now, sometimes that's the case. So that if it's top down and there's the top predator is keeping everything else in check, that's what we call top down regulation. But going back to this, if it's bottom up, that's usually the scarcity of resources. So for instance, this you can't really tell by looking at the graph really, unless you really see what's going on here. In this case, 1945, the lynx went up, and that means that drove the population down of the hare, and so forth, and it kind of keeps going back and forth based on that. So the population would probably be a top-down population control. But if I showed you a graph of just the hare, and then the amount of grass that was, the height of the grass that grew that year, that would be kind of a look at a bottom-up pressure, looking at is there enough resource available to feed that next trophic level up, and that would put the pressure on all the way up to the top. So sometimes it's the top-down population kind of regulating with predation. Sometimes it's the scarcity of resources. All right, humans are not exempt from nature's population controls. We have seen this a number of times, like in Ireland, the potato famine. You've heard of this probably in history or world history, I guess it would be, in 1845, causing a number of population to drop in Ireland quite a bit because of that plague or that potato crop famine. The bubonic plague, another example, in the 14th century, had a huge impact on the world population. Dropped down. If you look back in chapter 1, it shows the bubonic plague or the black plague, showing you that our population of the world dropped down a lot then. And even AIDS, that's another one right now. It's a global epidemic happening around the world that is keeping the population in check. And our last slide is the case study, exploding the white-tailed deer population in the U.S. 1900, the deer habitat destruction and had uncontrolled hunting, so it kind of drove those populations down. 1920s and 30s, we actually employed laws to protect those deer. And kind of controlled hunting a little bit more, and now we've had current populations explosion for deer, which kind of Lyme disease has been spread more because of that. Deer vehicle accidents obviously are another problem there, and even eating garden plants and shrubs. I had a problem with that this year. All my peach trees around my house were totally demolished by deer, so I got to figure out another way of trying to detract those deer from eating those. But that is just a couple of different, because of those population explosion, because of those laws, those things have kind of increased. And there are ways to control deer populations. Obviously, you have hunting season, which is starting up soon, or if it hasn't started already. Those are good ways to control deer population, because they either might starve because of lack of resources. Again, they might overshoot, which is a bad thing. We saw that earlier. Or they just cause a lot of other problems because of the huge size of their population. So that brings us to a close with 5-3. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.